When people imagine the fall of the Roman Empire, they picture barbarians at the gates, legions shattered, or emperors poisoned in marble palaces. But empires do not collapse only because of external attacks. They rot from within, and one of the greatest forces behind that decay is always money. Rome did not fall solely because of invasions or corruption. It also collapsed because its currency was debased. And the greatest lessons from that downfall still apply to every modern economy that continues to play games with money and assumes there will be no consequences. Let's picture the scene. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman economy was the silver denarius, introduced around 201 BC. This coin was nearly pure silver and was accepted without hesitation both inside and outside the empire. Roman soldiers were paid in it. Merchants demanded payment in it. Ordinary citizens saved their wealth in it. The denarius was more than money. It was trust cast into metal. The strength of the empire and the value of its currency were directly connected. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. But maintaining an empire is expensive. Legions must be paid. Roads and aqueducts must be built and maintained. Wars must be financed. By the 2nd century AD, Rome was struggling to defend its borders against Germanic tribes in the north, the Parthians in the east, and internal instability at home. Tax revenues were no longer sufficient to cover military expenses. So the rulers turned to a trick that had been used even in ancient times, debasement. Instead of raising taxes directly, which is rarely popular, they reduced the silver content of the denarius. The numbers tell the story. Under Augustus, the first emperor, the denarius contained roughly 95% silver. By the early 3rd century, during the reign of Caracalla, its silver content had fallen to about 50%. By the middle of that century, under Gallienus, it dropped below 5%. What had once been nearly pure silver became little more than a bronze disc coated with a thin layer of silver. The people noticed. They could see it. They could feel it. Inflation arrived at the door. The currency no longer carried real value. Goods that once cost 1 denarius suddenly required many more. This was not an abstract theory. It shattered the daily lives of ordinary Romans. Soldiers demanded higher wages to keep up with rising prices. Merchants began refusing debased coins, preferring barter or gold instead. Local economies reverted to direct exchange as trust in currency collapsed. As confidence fell, emperors minted even more coins of even lower quality, hoping that quantity would compensate for lost value. It was a vicious cycle, and history has repeated this pattern in many inflationary crises. The crisis reached its peak during the period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Between AD 235 and 284, Rome endured nearly 50 years of invasions, plagues, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell at dizzying speed. Many were assassinated. Behind the political chaos stood a broken financial system. Taxes were collected in money that continued to lose value. Farmers abandoned their fields to avoid impossible tax burdens. Trade routes deteriorated. The state attempted desperate measures to maintain control, including price controls and forced labor obligations. None of it worked. In AD 301, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. It fixed the prices of thousands of goods and services, from grain to labor wages. Violators could face death. The edict failed. Prices cannot be controlled by decree when the currency itself is collapsing. Black markets flourished. Official trade nearly froze. People quickly realized that laws cannot repair a debased coin. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius entirely. Around AD 312, Constantine the Great introduced a solidus, a stable gold coin. It remained in circulation in the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire for centuries. But by then, the Western Roman Empire was already nearing collapse. The debasement of the denarius had hollowed out Rome's economic core. The army became unmanageable. Trade networks fractured. Trust disappeared. Rome's fall was not a single dramatic event, but a long process of disintegration, and its currency crisis was one of the central forces behind it. So, what does this story tell us? When money is damaged, empires are damaged with it. Rome believed it could deceive its people by producing coins that looked the same but were worth less. Modern states often believe they can survive by printing money, manipulating interest rates, or inflating away debt. But the result is always the same. The public pays a price. Wealth erodes. Trust collapses. History continued to teach this lesson long after Rome. After World War I, Germany turned to money printing when faced with heavy reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. In 1923, hyperinflation spiraled out of control. Before the war, a loaf of bread cost 1 mark. By the autumn of 1923, it cost over 200 billion marks. People carried wages in wheelbarrows. Savings evaporated. The economic collapse became one of the conditions that enabled the rise of Adolf Hitler. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe followed a similar path. By 2008, inflation reached an annual rate of 89.7 trillion%. Prices doubled almost daily. Eventually, the country abandoned its own currency and adopted the U.S. dollar and the South African rand. Even in modern developed economies, Rome's shadow lingers. In 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The final link between money and a tangible backing was severed. The dollar became a purely fiat currency, supported not by gold, but by trust in the government. Since then, the purchasing power of the dollar has significantly declined. The pattern is always the same. Inflation is presented as growth. Rising wages are marketed as progress, while costs rise faster. Debt is sold as investment. Unlike Rome, today's system is global. Rome's collapse was imperial. Germany's hyperinflation was national. Zimbabwe's was local. But today's global financial order rests on fiat currencies, massive debt, and central banks prepare to create trillions in times of crisis. This means the next major collapse may not be confined to one nation. It could be systemic. What did Rome's currency crisis ultimately teach? First, inflation is not an accident. It is policy, a silent agent that has toppled empires for 2,000 years. Second, real wealth is not the number written on paper or on a screen. It is found in assets that retain value even when currency does not. Land, skills, productive businesses, and resources. Third, never assume the system is permanent. Romans in the first century would have laughed at the idea that their currency could become worthless. Germans in 1913 could not imagine wheelbarrows of money. Zimbabweans in the 1980s believed independence would bring economic prosperity. But the story always follows the same pattern. When money loses its credibility, society begins to fracture. Contracts fail. Trade becomes dysfunctional. Armies weaken. The state loses legitimacy. The barbarians at the gates may deliver the final blow, but the deeper wound is often inside the treasury. History does not repeat itself exactly, but if you fail to understand it, it will crush you in similar ways. Rome's monetary crisis was not only about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about the fragility of money when power abuses it. And that fragility has never disappeared. If this video gave you something valuable, consider subscribing. See you in the next one.